Chapter 1. The Sermon on Judas. The Sunday morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Church, casting a mosaic of reds and blues across the worn pews. The village of St. Mary Mead was quiet, as it always was, save for the gentle hum of hymnals and the occasional creak of a bench. Miss Jane Marple sat near the back, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. She wore her usual black coat and a prim hat adorned with a single feather, blending into the congregation like a sparrow among starlings. The vicar, Reverend Clement, stood at the pulpit, his voice rising with unusual fervour. He was a mild-mannered man prone to sermons on charity or forgiveness, but today his topic was betrayal. Judas Iscariot, the disciple who sold his master for 30 pieces of silver. Betrayal, he thundered, is a wound that festers in the heart, a sin that poisons trust. Judas thought his gain worth the cost, but what profit is there in a soul's ruin? Miss Marple tilted her head, noting the faint tremor in his voice. Curious, she thought. The vicar's eyes darted toward the front row, where Mrs. Price, the churchwarden's wife, sat with a tight smile. Beside her, young Tommy Pierce, a choir boy, fidgeted, his hymn book slipping from his hands. Across the aisle, Mr. Hargreaves, the village grocer, scowled at his hymn sheet as if it had personally offended him. The air felt thick with something unspoken. As the sermon ended, the congregation rose for the final hymn. The collection plate, a heavy silver dish engraved with vines, passed from hand to hand. Miss Marple dropped in a modest coin, watching as the plate moved down her pew. It reached Mrs. Dane, the vicar's wife, who stood at the aisle's end, her face pale beneath her Sunday hat. She took the plate, turned toward the vestry, and disappeared behind the oak door. The hymn ended, and the congregation settled back into their seats. Reverend Clement stepped forward, his hands clasped. "Thank you all for your generosity," he began. But Mrs. Dane emerged from the vestry, her eyes wide with panic. She whispered urgently in his ear, and his face drained of colour. "Dear friends," he said, his voice faltering, "it seems the collection plate is missing." A murmur rippled through the church. Mrs. Price gasped, clutching her pearls. Tommy Pierce shrank into his choir robe, his cheeks flushing. Mr. Hargreaves muttered something about thieves in the house of God. Miss Marple's lips pursed ever so slightly. Missing, she thought, or taken? Reverend Clement cleared his throat. "I'm sure it's a misunderstanding. Perhaps it was misplaced. We'll search the vestry and resolve this quietly." But his eyes betrayed his doubt, and the congregation's whispers grew louder. As the service ended, villagers spilled onto the churchyard path, their voices buzzing with speculation. Miss Marple lingered near the door, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. She overheard Mrs. Price hiss to her husband, "I saw that boy, Tommy, near the vestry earlier. Shifty, that one." "Nonsense," Mr. Price retorted. "It's probably Hargreaves. He's been sour since the vicar turned down his donation for the new roof." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. People, she knew, were rarely as discreet as they thought. She glanced at the vicarage across the lane, where Mrs. Dane stood at the window, her hands twisting a handkerchief. "A plate doesn't vanish," Miss Marple mused. "Someone took it, and someone knows why." She adjusted her hat and started down the path, her mind already sifting through the morning's details, the vicar's sermon, the choir boy's nerves, the grocer's scowl. The mystery of the missing collection plate had begun, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom, was already one step ahead. Before we move on, detective, where in the world are you solving mysteries with us? Drop your location in the comments. And if you're craving more twisted tales, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's case file gets even darker. Stay sharp. Chapter 2. Miss Marple's Quiet Observation. The churchyard of St. Mary's buzzed with hushed voices as the congregation lingered, their Sunday best rumpled by indignation. The missing collection plate had ignited St. Mary Mead's gossip mill, and theories flew like sparrows. Miss Jane Marple stood near the lich gate, her knitting bag dangling from her arm, her eyes soft but alert. She had a way of fading into the background, unnoticed yet all-seeing, like a shadow cast by the ancient yew tree overhead. Mrs. Price, her voice sharp as a paring knife, cornered Mrs. Weatherby, the village seamstress. "I'm telling you, it's that Tommy Pierce. I caught him loitering by the vestry last week, bold as brass. Probably sold the plate for pocket money." Mrs. Weatherby, a timid woman with a habit of agreeing, nodded. "Oh yes, boys can be trouble. But what about Mr. Hargreaves? He's been cross with the vicar ever since that roof fund business." Miss Marple's lips twitched. How predictable, she thought. Villagers always pointed fingers at the obvious, youthful mischief or old grudges. But the truth, she knew, often hid in plainer sight, in the small gestures people overlooked. She adjusted her spectacles and drifted toward the tea-table, where Mrs. Dane, the vicar's wife, was pouring weak tea with trembling hands. "Good morning, Mrs. Dane," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle as a summer breeze. "Such a pity about the collection plate. It's such a fine piece, isn't it? Silver, with those lovely vine engravings." Mrs. Dane's cup rattled against its saucer. "Oh, yes, Miss Marple, it's terribly old. A gift from the squire's family years ago. I can't imagine how it's gone missing." Her eyes darted toward the church, where Reverend Clement was speaking with Mr. Price, the churchwarden. Miss Marple sipped her tea, noting the faint blush on Mrs. Dane's cheeks. "I'm sure it will turn up. Things often do when one looks closely. Was it very full today? The plate, I mean." Mrs. Dane hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. "Not especially. A few coins, perhaps a note or two. But it's not the money, it's the principle, stealing from the church." She lowered her voice. "Reverend Clement is dreadfully upset. He thinks it's a sign after his sermon on Judas." "Judas," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes drifting to the crowd. "A sermon about betrayal does stir the mind, doesn't it?" She smiled, but her thoughts were elsewhere, replaying the morning. Tommy Pierce's dropped hymn book, Mr. Hargreaves's scowl, and the odd moment when Mrs. Price had fumbled with her handbag just as the plate passed by. As Mrs. Dane excused herself, Miss Marple wandered toward the church steps, where Tommy Pierce sat, kicking at a pebble. His choir robe was slightly askew, and his freckled face bore the weight of a secret. Miss Marple settled beside him, her knitting needles clicking softly. "Quite a morning, Tommy," she said, her tone warm. "You sang beautifully in the choir, though you seemed a bit distracted during the collection." Tommy's eyes widened, then dropped to his shoes. "I wasn't, Miss Marple. I dropped my book, that's all." "Of course," she said, her needles pausing. "Books can be slippery things, and churches can be distracting, with so many people coming and going. Did you notice anyone near the vestry today?" Tommy's fingers tugged at his sleeve. "No, ma'am. I mean, maybe Mrs. Price was there earlier, but I didn't see nothing." He stood abruptly, muttering about needing to help with the hymnals, and scurried off. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind cataloguing the boy's nerves, Mrs. Dane's unease, and the village's quick accusations. She glanced at the church door, where a single thread of green fabric clung to the frame, barely visible against the weathered wood. Interesting, she thought, tucking the observation away like a stitch in her knitting. As she strolled toward home, the village clock chimed noon. The mystery of the collection plate was no simple theft, she sensed. It was a thread in a larger tapestry, one woven with betrayal, just as the vicar had preached. And Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, was already unravelling the first knot. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Vicarage. The vicarage sat across the lane from St. Mary's Church, its rose-covered walls masking the unease within. Miss Marple, invited for afternoon tea, stepped into the parlour, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. The room smelled of lavender and old books, but the air was heavy with something less pleasant. Suspicion. Reverend Clement stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, while Mrs. Dane fussed with a tray of scones, her movements jerky. "Thank you for coming, Miss Marple," the vicar said, his voice strained. "This business with the collection plate has upset the parish terribly." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chintz armchair. Her eyes, bright behind her spectacles, took in the room. A cracked teacup on the mantel, a stack of unpaid bills half hidden under a Bible, and Mrs. Dane's nervous glance at her husband. A theft in church is no small matter. "Have you found any sign of the plate?" Reverend Clement shook his head. "None. We searched the vestry, the sacristy, even the organ loft. It's as if it vanished into thin air." He paused, his brow furrowing. "I can't help but wonder if my sermon provoked someone. Judas, betrayal. It was a strong message." Mrs. Dane dropped a spoon, the clatter loud in the quiet room. "Oh, Leonard, don't be absurd. Who would steal over a sermon?" Her laugh was brittle, and she busied herself pouring tea, though her hands shook. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression mild. "People can be sensitive to words, Mrs. Dane. Betrayal is a personal thing, after all. Perhaps someone felt pointed at." The vicar's face darkened. "If you're suggesting I accused anyone, Miss Marple, I assure you my sermon was general. Though—" He hesitated, glancing at his wife. "There have been tensions. Mr. Hargreaves, for one. He's been bitter since I refused his donation for the church roof. Said it was tainted money." "Tainted?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her voice deceptively casual. "That's a curious choice of words." Mrs. Dane interjected, her tone sharp. "It's nonsense. Hargreaves is just stingy. And then there's that Tommy Pierce, always sneaking about. I saw him near the vestry yesterday, you know, with that sly look of his." "Lenore," the vicar said, a warning in his voice. "Tommy's just a boy." "A boy with sticky fingers," Mrs. Dane muttered, then caught herself, forcing a smile. "I mean, not that I'm accusing anyone, Miss Marple. It's just the plate was my responsibility. I feel awful." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to a photograph on the sideboard. The vicar and Mrs. Dane, younger, smiling at a church. Fate. Beside it lay a hymn book, its cover worn but oddly pristine at the edges, as if recently handled. Interesting, she thought, filing it away. "Mrs. Dane," she said gently, "you mentioned the plate wasn't especially full. Was there anything unusual about the collection? A note, perhaps, or an odd coin?" Mrs. Dane's fingers tightened on her teacup. "No, nothing like that. Just the usual shillings and pence. I didn't look closely. I was in a hurry to get it to the vestry." Her eyes flicked to the vicar, who was staring out the window again. Reverend Clement cleared his throat. "Miss Marple, you've a reputation for noticing things. If you have any ideas about who might have taken the plate, I'd be grateful for your discretion. The parish is already in a state." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile serene. "I find that mysteries often solve themselves, given time and a little attention. People reveal more than they intend, don't they?" As she rose to leave, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the hymn book. A faint smudge of green thread clung to its spine, barely noticeable. She said nothing, but her mind hummed with connections. The thread at the church door, Tommy's nerves, the vicar's unease. The collection plate's disappearance was no random act, she was certain. It was a gesture, a message tied to the very betrayal the vicar had preached about. Stepping into the afternoon sun, Miss Marple adjusted her hat and started down the lane. The vicarage had given her more than tea. It had given her a glimpse into a marriage under strain and a parish rife with secrets. The next thread in the tapestry was waiting to be pulled. Chapter 4. The Curious Case of the Choir Boy. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead's cobbled lanes as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the village schoolhouse, where the church choir practised. Her knitting bag swung lightly at her side, but her mind was far from idle, turning over the morning's events like a gardener inspecting soil. Tommy Pierce, the freckled choir boy, had been a name on too many lips. Mrs. Price's, Mrs. Dane's, even the whispers of the congregation. His fidgeting during the service and hasty retreat from her questions had not gone unnoticed. The schoolhouse door was ajar, and the sound of halting sopranos drifted out. Miss Marple slipped inside, her footsteps soft on the worn floorboards. The choir boys stood in a ragged line, their voices wobbling through Abide With Me under the stern gaze of Mr. Ellison, the choir master. Tommy Pierce was at the far end, his eyes fixed on the floor, his hymn book clutched like a shield. Mr. Ellison clapped sharply. "Enough for today, boys. Tommy, stay back. You're flat again." The other boys scattered, their laughter echoing, while Tommy lingered, his shoulders hunched. Miss Marple approached, her smile as warm as a hearth fire. "Good afternoon, Tommy. I was just passing by and thought I'd listen to the choir. You have a fine voice, you know." Tommy's cheeks flushed, and he mumbled, "Thank you, Miss Marple." His fingers tugged at the hem of his sweater, where a loose green thread dangled. Miss Marple's eyes flickered to it, her expression unchanged. "Choir practice must be quite a responsibility," she said, settling onto a bench. "All those hymns to learn, and then the service on top of it. I imagine it keeps you busy." running about the church. Tommy shifted, his sneakers scuffing the floor. Suppose so. I don't run about, though. I just do my bit and go home. Of course, Miss Marple said, her needles clicking as she pulled out her knitting. But churches are full of nooks and crannies, aren't they? Easy to see things, or hear things without meaning to. Like yesterday, perhaps, near the vestry. Tommy's eyes widened, and he took a step back. I didn't see nothing, Miss Marple. I swear it. I was just putting away the hymn books, that's all. His voice cracked, and he glanced at the door as if plotting an escape. Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, like a breeze, coaxing a leaf from a branch. Now, Tommy, there's no need to fret. I'm not accusing you of anything. But if you saw something or someone, it might help find that collection plate. It's a dreadful thing, stealing from the church, but keeping a secret can weigh heavy too. Tommy bit his lip, his hands twisting together. For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the distant chime of the village clock. Then, in a rush, he blurted, I saw Mrs. Price all right. Yesterday, before evensong, she was in the vestry, looking at the plate. She didn't see me, but I saw her. She was holding it, like she was checking it or something. Miss Marple's needles paused, though her face showed only mild interest. Mrs. Price, you say? How? Curious. And did she take it, Tommy? No. I mean, I don't think so. She put it back and left. But... He hesitated, his voice dropping to a whisper. She looked angry, muttering to herself, like she does when she's cross with someone. I see, Miss Marple said, her eyes softening. You've done well to tell me, Tommy. Secrets are slippery things, aren't they? Best not to hold them too tightly. She reached into her bag and offered him a peppermint. Run along now and don't worry. I'll keep this between us. Tommy took the sweet and bolted, leaving Miss Marple alone in the schoolhouse. She sat for a moment, her knitting idle, her mind weaving together the boy's words. Mrs. Price in the vestry, handling the plate, angry. The green thread on Tommy's sweater, matching the one at the church door, and the hymn book in the vicarage. And the boy's fear, real but incomplete, as if he knew more than he'd said. Rising, Miss Marple tucked her knitting away and stepped into the evening light. Tommy's confession was a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole picture. Mrs. Price's involvement was intriguing, yet Miss Marple sensed the theft was more than a churchwarden's wife's pique. The shadow of Judas, of betrayal, loomed larger, and the next clue was waiting to be found. Chapter 5. The Shadow of Betrayal. The village of St. Mary Mead wore its evening calm like a well-worn shawl, but beneath the surface tensions simmered. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage parlour, the fire crackling softly, her knitting needles clicking in rhythm with her thoughts. Tommy Pierce's confession about Mrs. Price had added a thread to the tapestry of the missing collection plate, but it was the vicar's sermon on Judas, betrayal's bitter sting, that lingered in her mind. Betrayal, she knew, was rarely impulsive. It grew from old wounds, carefully nursed. The next morning, Miss Marple strolled to the village shop, where gossip flowed as freely as tea. Mr. Hargreaves, the grocer, stood behind the counter, his face sour as he weighed apples for Mrs. Weatherby. The shop was crowded, and Miss Marple, blending into the background, listened as villagers traded theories about the theft. "It's a disgrace," Mrs. Price declared, her voice carrying over the clink of coins. She stood by the tinned goods, her churchwarden's badge pinned proudly to her coat. "Stealing from the church! I'd wager it's that Tommy Pierce. Boys like him have no respect." Mr. Hargreaves snorted, slamming the scale. "Respect? Mrs. Price, you're one to talk, always lording it over the parish. Maybe someone took the plate to spite you." His eyes gleamed with malice, and a hush fell over the shop. Mrs. Price's cheeks reddened. "How dare you? If anyone's got a grudge, it's you, John Hargreaves. Everyone knows you've been at odds with Reverend Clement since he called your money tainted." Miss Marple's ears pricked at the word, echoing the vicar's own phrase. She stepped forward, her voice mild. "Good morning, Mr. Hargreaves, Mrs. Price. Such a fuss about the collection plate, isn't it? I wonder, Mr. Hargreaves, why the vicar would say such a thing about your donation." Hargreaves stiffened, his hands pausing over a crate of potatoes. "It's nothing but spite," he growled. "2 years ago I offered £100 for the church roof. Good money, earned fair. But Clement refused it, said it wasn't properly come by. As if I'm some crook. He's had it in for me ever since I caught him." He stopped, his jaw tightening. "Caught him?" Miss Marple's tone was gentle, encouraging, like a friend sharing a confidence. Hargreaves glanced around, then leaned in, his voice low. "I saw him one night in the church with someone he shouldn't have been with. Not Mrs. Dane, mind you. I never said a word, but he's been cold to me since." Mrs. Price gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "You're lying, John Hargreaves. The vicar's a godly man." "Is he?" Hargreaves shot back. "Then why's his wife so jumpy? Ask her about the letters she's been hiding. I saw her slip one into her pocket last week. Looked like she'd seen a ghost." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles, though her face remained serene. "Letters, you say? How curious. People do keep such interesting secrets, don't they?" She paid for a tin of biscuits and left, her mind buzzing. Outside, she paused by the shop window, where a faded poster for last year's church fete caught her eye. In the photo, Mrs. Price stood beside the vicar, her smile tight, while Mrs. Dane lingered in the background, her eyes downcast. Secrets, Miss Marple thought, and grudges. They're the roots of this theft. Later, at the post office, Miss Marple overheard Mrs. Weatherby whispering to the postmistress, "I heard Mrs. Dane's been getting strange letters, no return address. She burns them in the vicarage fireplace, but last week she dropped one. Had a green wax seal fancy-like." Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her knitting bag. Green thread, green wax, green suspicions. The pieces were scattered, but they were beginning to form a pattern. Hargreaves's grudge, Mrs. Dane's letters, Mrs. Price's anger, they all pointed to a betrayal older and deeper than a stolen plate. The vicar's sermon had stirred something, and someone had struck back. As she walked home, the church bell tolled, a solemn reminder of the mystery at hand. Miss Marple knew the next step was to follow the trail of those letters. They held a key, she was certain, to the heart of the betrayal that had set this theft in motion. Chapter 6. A Trail of Crumbs. The morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead like a gossamer veil, softening the edges of the village's stone walls and thatched roofs. Miss Jane Marple stepped out of her cottage, her knitting bag over her arm, her mind fixed on the green threads weaving through the mystery of the missing collection plate. The thread on the church door, on Tommy Pierce's sweater, and on the vicarage hymn book was no coincidence. It was a breadcrumb, and Miss Marple was adept at following trails. She made her way to St. Mary's Church, where the air smelled of damp stone and candle wax. The congregation had dispersed, leaving the church quiet save for the creak of pews settling in the cold. Miss Marple paused by the vestry door, where she'd first spotted the green thread. Kneeling with the grace of habit, she examined the frame again. There, caught in a splinter of wood, was another wisp of green, finer than before, like silk torn from a scarf. Curious, she thought, tucking the thread into her handkerchief. Silk was not common in St. Mary Mead, where wool and cotton reigned. It suggested someone with means or pretensions. Mrs. Price, perhaps, with her fondness for flashy accessories. Or Mrs. Dane, whose nervous hands might have frayed a finer garment. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the churchyard, landing on the path to the old tithe barn, a crumbling structure used for storage since the church fete. The barn's door was ajar, and a faint scuff in the mud suggested recent visitors. She approached, her steps deliberate, and pushed the door open. The interior was dim, smelling of mildew and forgotten hay. Stacks of crates held fete decorations, bunting, lanterns, and a tarnished tea-urn. But something else caught her eye, a glint of silver beneath a burlap sack. Her heart quickened, but it was only a dented candlestick, not the collection plate. Yet, as she moved the sack, a scrap of green silk fluttered to the floor, its edges frayed. Miss Marple picked it up, her fingers tracing the fabric. It matched the threads perfectly, and its sheen hinted at a scarf or shawl, perhaps one worn to Sunday service. "Who's there?" a voice called, sharp and startled. Mrs. Weatherby, the seamstress, stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, a basket of mending at her feet. Her eyes widened at the sight of Miss Marple. "Oh, Miss Marple, you gave me a fright. What are you doing in here?" Miss Marple smiled, slipping the fabric into her pocket. "Just reminiscing, Mrs. Weatherby. The fete was so lively last year, wasn't it? I thought I'd see what's left of it. Have you been sorting things in here?" Mrs. Weatherby's cheeks flushed. "Me? Oh, no. I just came to fetch some old tablecloths for mending. The vicar asked me to tidy up." Her fingers twisted the edgy handle of her basket, and Miss Marple noted a green smudge on her cuff. Thread or dye, it was hard to tell. "How kind of you," Miss Marple said, her tone warm. "This barn's full of treasures, isn't it? Though I suppose it's a bit out of the way for most. Have you seen anyone else poking about?" Mrs. Weatherby hesitated, her eyes darting to the crates. "Well, I did see Tommy Pierce here yesterday, rummaging like he was looking for something. And Mrs. Price was by last week, said she was checking the fete supplies, but I didn't think much of it." "Mrs. Price again," Miss Marple murmured, her needles clicking as she pulled out her knitting. "She's quite involved in church affairs, isn't she? And Tommy, such a curious boy. Did either of them mention the collection plate?" "No, nothing like that," Mrs. Weatherby said quickly, then softened, though Mrs. Price was cross about something, muttering about debts unpaid, whatever that means. "I didn't ask. She's not one for questions." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the seamstress's words. Debts, green silk, A barn visited by too many. The plate wasn't here, but someone had been, and the scrap of fabric was proof. "Thank you, Mrs. Weatherby," she said, rising. "You've been most helpful. I'll let you get back to your mending." As she left the barn, the church bell tolled, a solemn note in the misty air. The green silk was a clue, but it raised more questions. Was it Mrs. Price's, tied to her anger and debts? Or Mrs. Dane's, linked to her secretive letters? Or perhaps someone else, lurking in the shadows of betrayal? Miss Marple tightened her shawl and headed home, certain the barn was only a stop on the trail, not the end. Chapter 7. The Midnight Confession. The moon hung low over St. Mary Mead, silvering the rooftops and casting long shadows across the churchyard. Miss Jane Marple, unable to sleep, sat by her cottage window, her knitting idle in her lap. The green silk scrap from the tithe barn weighed on her mind, as did the whispers of debts and letters. When the church clock struck 11, she glimpsed a flicker of light near St. Mary's, a lantern perhaps, moving towards the vestry door. Curious, she thought, slipping on her coat and scarf. The night was crisp, the air sharp with the scent of frost. Miss Marple moved silently, her steps light on the gravel path. The church loomed ahead, its stained glass windows dark, save for a faint glow from within. She reached the vestry door, which stood slightly ajar, and peered inside. A figure knelt by the altar, head bowed, a lantern casting trembling shadows on the stone floor. "Mrs. Dane?" Miss Marple's voice was soft, but it echoed in the silent church. Lenore Dane gasped, scrambling to her feet. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, and a crumpled letter lay beside her, its green wax seal broken. "Miss Marple, I didn't hear you. What are you doing here?" "I might ask you the same," Miss Marple said, stepping closer, her tone gentle but firm. "It's late for prayer, Mrs. Dane, and you seem troubled. Is it the collection plate?" Mrs. Dane's hands twisted together, her voice barely a whisper. "It's everything. The plate, the sermon, the secrets. I can't bear it any more." She sank onto a pew, her shoulders shaking. "I took it, Miss Marple. I took the collection plate." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose, though her face remained calm. She sat beside Mrs. Dane, her knitting bag at her side. "Took it, you say? That's a serious thing, Mrs. Dane. Perhaps you'd better tell me why." Mrs. Dane's words spilled out in a rush, like water from a cracked dam. "It was after the sermon. Leonard's words, Judas, betrayal, they cut me. I've been getting letters, anonymous, cruel ones, accusing me of indiscretions. They said I'd betrayed my husband, my vows. I was so angry, so ashamed. When I took the plate to the vestry, I hid it in a fit of spite. I thought, if the church could judge me, I'd judge it back." Miss Marple's eyes flickered to the letter on the floor, its green seal glinting in the lantern light. "And where is the plate now, Mrs. Dane?" Mrs. Dane's face crumpled. "I don't know. I hid it in the vestry, behind the old hymnals. But when I came back later, it was gone." "Someone else took it, Miss Marple. I swear it." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Mrs. Dane's confession explained her nerves, but not the plate's true disappearance. The green thread, the silk in the barn, Tommy's sighting of Mrs. Price. They pointed to a second act, a deeper betrayal. "These letters," she said, picking up the crumpled paper. May I see?" Mrs. Dane hesitated, then nodded. The letter was short, typed in stark black ink. "You've betrayed him, Lenore. The village knows. Pay for your sins, or they'll know more." No signature, only the green wax seal pressed with a simple cross. "Pay," Miss Marple murmured. "A demand, perhaps? Or a taunt? Mrs. Dane, who knew you hid the plate?" "No one," Mrs. Dane's voice broke. "I didn't tell a soul, but someone must have seen me. The vestry's not locked during service." Miss Marple folded the letter, tucking it into her bag. "You've been brave to tell me, Mrs. Dane. Go home now, and say nothing of this. The plate will be found, and the truth with it." Mrs. Dane nodded, wiping her eyes, and slipped out into the night. Miss Marple lingered, her gaze sweeping the vestry. The hymnals were neatly stacked, but one was slightly askew, its spine bearing a faint smudge of green. She opened it, finding nothing inside, but the smudge matched the thread, the silk, the seal. Someone watched, she thought. Someone knew. As she stepped into the churchyard, the clock struck midnight, its chime a solemn warning. Mrs. Dane's confession was a step toward the truth, but the real thief, the one who took the plate from its hiding place, remained in the shadows. The letters, the green clues, the sermon's echo of Judas. They all pointed to a betrayal far more personal than a stolen plate. Miss Marple tightened her scarf and headed home, ready to unravel the next thread. Chapter 8. The Judas Connection. The morning sun broke through the mist over St. Mary Mead, gilding the church spire as Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, a cup of tea cooling beside her. Her knitting needles lay still, her mind weaving together the threads of the mystery. Mrs. Dane's confession, the green silk, the anonymous letters with their green wax seals. The vicar's sermon on Judas had been no mere coincidence. It was the spark that ignited the theft. A mirror held up to someone's guilt. Betrayal, Miss Marple knew, was a wound that festered, and the collection plate's disappearance was its symptom. She made her way to the vicarage, where Reverend Clement was pruning roses, his face etched with worry. "Miss Marple," he greeted, setting down his shears. "Any news of the plate? The parish is restless, and Lenore's beside herself." "Patience, Reverend," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. "The truth has a way of surfacing. Your sermon on Judas was quite stirring. Did you have anyone particular in mind when you wrote it?" The vicar stiffened, his eyes flickering to the vicarage window, where Mrs. Dane's silhouette moved. "No, one specific," he said too quickly. "It's a universal theme, isn't it? Betrayal touches us all." He clipped a rose with unnecessary force, petals scattering. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Indeed, though it's curious how some feel it more keenly. I've heard whispers of letters, Reverend, letters accusing your wife of betrayal. Do you know anything about them?" Reverend Clement's face paled. "Letters? Lenore mentioned nothing, but she's been distracted lately, burning papers in the fireplace. I thought it was just household accounts." He paused, his voice dropping. "Miss Marple, you don't think she's involved with the plate?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that someone in this village feels betrayed, and your sermon stirred their anger. The plate's theft was no whim. It was personal. Tell me, have you crossed anyone lately beyond Mr. Hargreaves?" The vicar hesitated, then sighed. Mrs. Price, perhaps. She's been overzealous as churchwarden, pushing for changes I couldn't approve. Last month she wanted to replace the old hymnals, said they were shabby. I refused. They're a gift from my late mother. She took it badly, called me ungrateful. Ungrateful, Miss Marple murmured, her mind flashing to Mrs. Price's anger in the shop, her muttering about debts unpaid. And has she ever mentioned debts or old promises? Reverend Clement frowned. Not directly, but years ago, before you came to St. Mary Mead, her husband loaned me money for the vicarage repairs. I paid it back, but Mrs. Price always hinted I owed her more. Loyalty, perhaps. She's never forgiven me for siding with Lenore over her in church matters. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts aligning like stitches in a pattern. Mrs. Price's resentment, Mrs. Dane's letters, the green silk found in the barn. They pointed to a vendetta, one cloaked in the language of Judas. She thanked the vicar and turned to leave, but paused. One more thing, Reverend. Have you seen a green silk scarf or shawl about? Perhaps Mrs. Price's? He shook his head. Not that I recall. Lenore has a green shawl, but it's wool, not silk. Why do you ask? Just a fancy, Miss Marple said, smiling. But her mind was racing. The silk wasn't Mrs. Dane's, nor likely Mrs. Price's, who favoured gaudy brooches over fine fabrics. Someone else, then. Someone close enough to know the vicarage's secrets, to pen cruel letters, to seize the plate from Mrs. Dane's hiding-place. As she walked home, Miss Marple passed Mrs. Weatherby's cottage, where the seamstress was pinning fabric in her window. A bolt of green silk lay on her table, its sheen catching the light. Miss Marple's step slowed. Mrs. Weatherby, timid and overlooked, had been in the barn, had seen Tommy and Mrs. Price, had mending that might conceal a torn scarf. Curious, she thought, filing it away. The sermon's theme of betrayal had unmasked a deeper grudge, one tied to debts and loyalties, real or imagined. The plate was a symbol, Miss Marple realized, of a debt someone felt was still unpaid. Which is the next step was to trace the green silk to its source, and the heart of the vengeance that drove the theft. Chapter 9. The Gathering of Suspects. The vicarage parlour was stifling despite the open windows, the air thick with anticipation. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed chair, her knitting bag at her feet, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. Around her, the key players in the mystery of the missing collection plate fidgeted. Reverend Clement, his face drawn. Mrs. Dane, twisting a handkerchief. Mrs. Price, her churchwarden's badge glinting defiantly. Mr. Hargreaves, scowling at the floor. Tommy Pierce, shrinking into a corner. And Mrs. Weatherby, clutching a sewing basket as if it were a lifeline. The village clock chimed 7, each note a prelude to revelation. "Thank you for coming," Miss Marple began, her voice calm but commanding. "The theft of the collection plate has troubled St. Mary Mead, but I believe we're close to the truth. It's a matter of betrayal, as Reverend Clement's sermon so aptly highlighted. Shall we unravel it together?" Mrs. Price bristled. "This is absurd, Miss Marple. If you're accusing me, I won't stand for it. I've served this church faithfully." "Faithfully, perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone mild, "but not without resentment. You were seen in the vestry, Mrs. Price, handling the plate before it vanished. And you've spoken of debts unpaid, haven't you? Debts you felt the vicar owed you." Mrs. Price's face reddened. "I was checking the plate for scratches. And yes, I felt slighted. Reverend Clement dismissed my loyalty, my husband's loan. But I didn't steal anything." Reverend Clement cleared his throat. "Miss Marple, surely you don't think—" Miss Marple raised a hand. "Let's consider Mrs. Dane, then. You admitted to hiding the plate, Mrs. Dane, in a moment of anger after the sermon. You felt accused by those anonymous letters, didn't you? Letters with green wax seals, hinting at betrayal." Mrs. Dane gasped, her handkerchief shredding in her hands. "I told you in confidence. Yes, I hid it, but I didn't take it from the vestry. Someone else did." "Someone who knew it was there," Miss Marple said, her eyes drifting to Tommy Pierce. "Tommy, you saw Mrs. Price in the vestry, but you've been nervous, haven't you? Dropping hymn books, avoiding questions. Did you see something else that day?" Tommy's freckles stood out against his pale cheeks. I saw Mrs. Dane hide the plate," he mumbled, "behind the hymnals. I didn't tell anyone, I swear. But I went back later, and it was gone." Mr. Hargreaves snorted. "Likely story. Boy, you probably took it yourself, sold it for sweets." His voice dripped with contempt, but Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow. "Mr. Hargreaves," she said, "you've no love for the vicar, have you? You offered money for the church roof, and he refused it, calling it tainted. You hinted at seeing him with someone, a secret you've held like a weapon. Did you take the plate to settle that score?" Hargreaves's fists clenched. "I'm no thief. I saw Clement with a woman years ago, but I kept quiet. If I wanted revenge, I'd have spoken, not stolen." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze settling on Mrs. Weatherby, who flinched. "And you, Mrs. Weatherby, were in the tithe barn, where I found a scrap of green silk, the same silk as the threads on the church door, Tommy's sweater, and the vicarage hymn book. You've access to such fabric, don't you? And you've heard every whisper in this village." Mrs. Weatherby's needle slipped, pricking her finger. I only mend clothes, Miss Marple. I saw Tommy and Mrs. Price in the barn, but I didn't take anything. I'm no one, just a seamstress." "No one," Miss Marple murmured, "is often the one who sees the most. The plate's theft was no simple act. Mrs. Dane hid it, but someone took it from the vestry. Someone who knew her secret, who used green silk to mark their path, who wrote letters to torment her. This was vengeance, planned and personal, sparked by the sermon's echo of Judas." The room fell silent, eyes darting between faces. Miss Marple's needles clicked once, a deliberate sound. The truth lies in the green clues: thread, silk, wax. They point to someone who moves unseen, who harbours a grudge older than the plate itself. I believe I know who, but I'd like to hear it from them first. She leaned forward, her gaze steady, waiting for the crack in the facade. The air tightened, as if the room itself held its breath, poised for the final thread to snap. Chapter 10. The final twist. The vicarage parlour seemed to shrink under the weight of Miss Marple's words, the silence so taut it could snap. Reverend Clement gripped the arm of his chair. Mrs. Dane's handkerchief was a tattered ruin, and Mrs. Price's eyes blazed with defiance. Mr. Hargreaves shifted uneasily. Tommy Pierce stared at his shoes, and Mrs. Weatherby's needle trembled in her hand. Miss Marple sat serene, her knitting bag at her feet, her gaze moving from face to face like a lantern-piercing fog. "Betrayal," she said softly, "is a quiet poison, but it leaves traces. The green silk, the letters, the stolen plate, they all point to someone who felt wronged, someone who used the sermon on Judas as a stage. I thought it was vengeance against Mrs. Dane, or perhaps the vicar. But I was mistaken. The true target was the church itself, and the thief was hiding in plain sight." Mrs. Price scoffed. "This is nonsense, Miss Marple. You've accused us all and found nothing. The plate's gone, and you're spinning tales." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Not quite, Mrs. Price. Let me tell you a story. Mrs. Dane hid the plate in the vestry, driven by shame from those cruel letters. Someone saw her, someone who knew the church's rhythms, who moved unnoticed. They took the plate, not for money, but to expose a deeper betrayal. The green silk was their signature, left deliberately to lead us astray." She turned to Mrs. Weatherby, whose face drained of colour. "Mrs. Weatherby, you're a seamstress, with access to green silk. You were in the tithe barn, where I found a scrap of it. You knew about Mrs. Dane's letters, didn't you? You overheard her at the post office burning them, and you've long felt overlooked, haven't you, by the church you've served so quietly." Mrs. Weatherby's voice was a whisper. I never meant harm, Miss Marple. I mended the choir robes, the altar cloths, for years, and no one noticed. But I didn't take the plate." "No," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but firm. "You didn't. You wrote the letters, though, didn't you? To stir trouble, to make Mrs. Dane feel the sting of being unseen, just as you have. The green wax seals were your touch, a seamstress's flair. But the plate's theft was beyond you." Mrs. Weatherby sobbed, nodding. "I wrote them. I was angry, bitter. But I swear I didn't touch the plate." The room gasped, but Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Tommy Pierce, who shrank further into his corner. "Tommy," she said, "you saw Mrs. Dane hide the plate. You told me you went back and it was gone. But you didn't tell me everything, did you? You took it, didn't you, to protect someone?" Tommy's eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean to, Miss Marple. I saw Mrs. Dane hide it, and I thought it was wrong, her taking it. So I took it to give it back, but then I got scared. I hid it in the barn, under the crates. I didn't know what to do." Miss Marple nodded, but her eyes moved to Reverend Clement, whose knuckles were white. "And you, Reverend," she said, her voice like a blade wrapped in velvet, "knew Tommy had it. You saw him slip into the barn, didn't you? You took the plate from there, not to return it, but to keep it hidden, because the real betrayal was yours." The room froze. Mrs. Dane's breath caught, and Mrs. Price's jaw dropped. Reverend Clement's face crumpled, his voice hoarse. "Miss Marple, what are you saying?" "I'm saying," Miss Marple said, "that the plate's theft was a distraction, a way to shift blame. Years ago you betrayed your parish, didn't you? Mr. Hargreaves saw you with a woman, a secret you buried. But someone else knew, someone who sent those letters, not just to Mrs. Dane, but to you. You preached on Judas to confront your own guilt, but when the plate vanished, you saw a chance to pin it on your wife, to silence the whispers. You took it from the barn and hid it in the church crypt, where you thought no one would look." Reverend Clement's shoulders sagged, his voice breaking. I was weak years ago. A moment of folly, long repented. The letters started last month, threatening to expose me. When I found the plate in the barn, I thought, if Lenore was blamed, the letters might stop. I'm so sorry." Mrs. Dane wept, but Miss Marple's face softened. "The plate is still in the crypt, isn't it? A symbol of your shame, not hers. Betrayal, Reverend, always comes to light." The room erupted in murmurs, shock rippling through the suspects. Miss Marple sat back, her work nearly done, the truth laid bare like a finished quilt. The vicar's. Deception had unravelled, but one task remained, to restore what was lost. Chapter 11. The Plate Restored. The morning after the vicarage gathering dawned soft and clear, the sun warming the stones of St. Mary Mead's churchyard. Miss Jane Marple stood by the lich gate, her knitting bag at her side, watching as a small group gathered at St. Mary's Church. The air was lighter now, the weight of secrets lifted, though the village would hum with whispers for weeks to come. "Reverend," Clement emerged from the church, the silver collection plate gleaming in his hands. He'd retrieved it from the crypt, just as Miss Marple had deduced, its vine engravings catching the light as if untouched by the drama it had sparked. The congregation murmured, some with relief, others with lingering shock at the vicar's confession. Miss Marple had orchestrated the resolution with her usual discretion. After the vicar's admission, she'd spoken privately with him and Mrs. Dane, urging honesty and reconciliation. Reverend Clement had confessed his past indiscretion to the parish council, offering to step down. To his surprise, they'd voted for him to stay, moved by his remorse and Mrs. Dane's quiet strength in forgiving him. The letters, penned by Mrs. Weatherby, would cease. She'd tearfully promised Miss Marple to channel her bitterness into her sewing instead. Tommy Pierce, cleared of theft but chastened by his role, stood by the church door, his choir robe neatly pressed. Miss Marple approached, offering a peppermint from her bag. "You did well, Tommy," she said, her voice warm. "Truth is a heavy thing, but it's lighter when shared." Tommy blushed, popping the sweet into his mouth. "I'm sorry, Miss Marple. I just wanted to fix things." "And you helped," she said, patting his shoulder. "Mind you keep those hymn books steady from now on." Mrs. Price, her pride dented but her churchwarden's badge still pinned, hovered nearby, her accusation silenced by the truth. She nodded stiffly to Miss Marple, a grudging acknowledgment of the old lady's insight. Mr. Hargreaves, his grudge against the vicar softened by the revelation, had donated a modest sum for the church roof, this time accepted without question. Mrs. Dane approached, her face tired but serene. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice steady, "I can't thank you enough. You saw through the shadows, gave us a chance to heal. The plate's back, and so is our hope." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "People are like gardens, Mrs. Dane. They need a bit of pruning to flourish. You and the vicar will tend to each other now, I'm sure." As the congregation filed into the church for the morning service, Miss Marple lingered outside, her gaze on the horizon. The plate's theft had been a mirror, reflecting the village's hidden hurts, Mrs. Weatherby's neglect, Mrs. Dane's shame, the vicar's guilt, Tommy's fear. Betrayal, as the sermon had warned, was a wound, but truth was its salve. She adjusted her hat and started down the lane, her knitting bag swinging lightly. The mystery was solved, the plate restored, and St. Mary Mead was at peace, at least until the next ripple stirred its quiet waters. Miss Marple's work was done, and as she passed the vicarage roses, she hummed softly, already wondering what secrets the next Sunday might bring.